They laughed at me, not quietly, not awkwardly. They laughed out loud, right there, in front of everyone. I remember the sound more than the faces, that quick burst of laughter, sharp, dismissive, the kind that doesn't ask questions. I had just finished speaking. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't exaggerated. I simply said what I was proud of, something I worked toward for a long time, something personal, something that mattered. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. My sister was the first to react. She tilted her head, smiled, then laughed, not because it was funny, but because to her it was obvious. Seriously? She said. That single word said everything. My mother didn't say much. She nodded slowly, like she was agreeing with an unspoken conclusion. My father leaned back in his chair, shrugged, as if to say, well, that's that. No one asked how long it took. No one asked why it mattered. No one asked how I felt. They had already decided. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, waiting. Not for praise, not for applause, just for basic respect. It didn't come. So I did the only thing that felt right. I smiled. A small smile. Polite, controlled. And I stayed quiet. At first, the silence felt heavy, like something unfinished, like I had left the room without closing the door. I could have explained myself. I could have defended my choices. I could have listed facts and effort. But something stopped me. I realized they weren't listening. They weren't curious. They weren't confused. They were already convinced, and no explanation would change that. So I said nothing. I nodded once, excused myself, and let the conversation move on without me. That moment stayed with me, not because it hurt, but because it clarified something I hadn't seen before. In my family, silence was seen as weakness. If you didn't argue, you didn't care. If you didn't fight back, you had nothing to defend. That's what they believed. And for the first time, I decided not to challenge it. Not out of fear, not out of shame, but out of awareness. Silence, I realized, could be a choice, and sometimes a very strategic one. As the evening went on, they laughed about other things. They talked over each other, shared stories, made plans. I listened, I observed, and quietly, I made a decision. I would stop explaining myself. Not just tonight, but from that point on. I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't convince, I wouldn't seek permission to be proud. If they wanted to underestimate me, I would let them, because something told me that time would eventually do the explaining for me. And when it did, I wouldn't need to say a word. After that day, something changed in me. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. I didn't cut my family off. I didn't confront anyone. On the surface, nothing looked different. We still talked, we still met, we still shared meals. But I stopped offering pieces of myself for judgment. I answered questions briefly, carefully. How's work? Fine. What are you up to lately? Busy. No details, no enthusiasm, no invitations for opinions. At first, it felt unnatural. I was used to explaining myself, defending choices, filling silences. Now I let the silences stay. And something interesting happened. They didn't push. They didn't ask more. They seemed relieved, as if my quiet confirmed what they already believed, that I had slowed down, that I had settled, that nothing important was happening. They started talking more about themselves, their plans, their problems, their opinions. I listened, and I noticed patterns I hadn't seen before. They only respected what looked impressive immediately. Anything that required patience bored them. Anything that didn't come with instant results was dismissed. Understanding that changed how I saw everything. It wasn't personal. They weren't laughing at me. They were laughing at what they couldn't recognize. That realization made silence easier. Weeks passed, then months. Life outside of family gatherings moved forward, quietly, steadily. I woke up early, worked late, refined what I was building. There were setbacks, there are doubts, but I handled them alone, without commentary, without updates, and without the weight of their expectations. That was new. I realized how much energy I had wasted trying to be understood, trying to sound impressive enough. Now that energy went somewhere else, into progress. Family dinners continued. My sister still joked, still teased, but the jokes changed. They became lighter, less direct, as if she wasn't entirely sure anymore. My parents stopped asking when I would figure things out. They assumed I already had, just not in a way worth discussing. And I let them assume. I learned something important during that time. Silence doesn't just hide things from others, it reveals things to yourself. Without constant feedback, I started trusting my own judgment more. I didn't need reactions to know I was moving in the right direction. And slowly, very slowly, a sense of calm replaced the old frustration. I no longer felt small in those rooms. I felt detached, observant, prepared. I didn't know yet how or when things would change. I just knew they would, because time has a way of exposing what laughter tries to dismiss, and I was willing to wait. Time passed without announcements. No milestones shared, no updates sent. From the outside, it probably looked like nothing was happening. But underneath that quiet surface, things were changing. Slowly, deliberately. My days developed a rhythm. Wake up, work, adjust, repeat. There was comfort in that routine. No one watching, no one judging, just progress measured privately. I stopped comparing myself to anyone in my family. Their timelines didn't apply to me anymore. Their opinions didn't either. At family gatherings, I became background noise. Present, polite, unremarkable. And strangely, that suited me. I noticed how conversations flowed around me without landing. They talked about promotions, about purchases, about visible wins. They liked things you could point at. I nodded when appropriate, smiled when expected, and said very little. The less I spoke, the more they filled the space. They speculated quietly. They assumed I had paused my ambitions, that I had chosen something smaller. They weren't cruel about it, just confident. Confidence without curiosity, and that confidence made them careless. They stopped paying attention, which gave me freedom. Outside of those moments, my life felt different, focused, intentional. I started seeing results, not dramatic ones, not overnight success, but signs, subtle confirmations that my direction made sense. I learned to recognize them without needing applause. That was new. There were nights when I thought about saying something, just one sentence, just enough to correct the picture. But every time I imagined it, I saw the same outcome: a laugh, a shrug, a dismissal. So I stayed quiet. Not out of fear, out of clarity. Silence became a filter. If someone truly wanted to know, they would ask. No one did. And that told me everything. Months turned into more months. The gap between who they thought I was and who I was becoming widened. I could feel it, not as tension, as distance. They still treated me kindly, but with a certain casual disregard, like someone who no longer needed to be considered. And again, I let it happen, because something had shifted inside me. I no longer needed their recognition to validate my choices. The quiet had done its work. It had stripped away the noise, the expectations, the pressure. All that remained was intention. I didn't know when that difference would matter. I just knew that when it did, it wouldn't need explanation because results don't argue, they arrive. And when they do, they tend to speak for themselves. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no single moment where everything suddenly felt different. It was gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. I started realizing that my silence was changing how I moved through the world. I wasn't waiting anymore, not for approval, not for reactions, not for anyone to catch up. I made decisions faster, not impulsively, confidently, because I wasn't imagining how they would sound when explained to someone else. That mental noise was gone. Family conversations became predictable. I could almost script them in my head. Someone would bring up a problem, someone else would complain, someone would joke to soften the tension. They never asked me what I thought, and I never volunteered. That dynamic stayed the same, but outside of it, my life didn't. I started meeting new people, not through family, not through introductions, people who only knew me as I was now. They didn't have old assumptions. They didn't carry outdated versions of me in their heads. They listened. They asked questions. And when I spoke, they took me seriously. That contrast was striking. It made something very clear. The problem had never been my pace. It had been my audience. Back home, nothing changed. My sisters still spoke with certainty. My parents still assumed they knew what was best. They talked about being realistic, about not getting ahead of yourself. They meant well, but meaning well doesn't prevent harm. It just makes it quieter. One evening, I caught my reflection in the mirror after a family dinner. I looked calm, not tense, not defensive, detached. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to prove anything. That realization surprised me. I had spent years thinking that if I could just explain myself better, things would be different. But explanation had never been the issue. Timing was. Understanding that made patience easier. I didn't rush anything. I didn't force outcomes. I focused on consistency, on showing up for my own life, even when no one else was watching. Progress continued. Slow, real. There were moments of doubt, moments where I wondered if staying silent was a mistake. But every time I considered speaking up, I asked myself one question: would this change anything? The answer was always the same: not yet. So I waited. Not passively, purposefully. I didn't know what form the turning point would take. I only knew it would come. Because situations have a way of revealing who is actually prepared. And I was preparing. Quietly. Without applause, without witnesses. Just me and time. The call came on a day that felt completely ordinary. No warning, no buildup, no sense that anything was about to change. I was in the middle of my routine, focused, calm. My phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. Then I saw my sister's name. That alone was unexpected. We hadn't spoken properly in a long time, not beyond short messages, not beyond surface level exchanges. I hesitated before answering, not out of anger, out of curiosity. Her voice sounded different, careful, controlled. She didn't joke, she didn't tease. She asked how I was, not casually, not automatically. She waited for the answer. That pause told me everything. I said I was fine. Another pause followed. Then she started explaining, slowly, choosing her words. Something had gone wrong, something serious. Not a small inconvenience, not a passing problem. The kind of situation people don't joke about, the kind that makes confidence disappear. As she spoke, I listened closely, not just to what she was saying, but to how she was saying it. There was uncertainty there, a hesitation I had never heard from her before. She mentioned details, names, timelines, consequences. The more she talked, the clearer it became. This wasn't something they could fix themselves. They had already tried. They had already argued. They had already dismissed the easy solutions. And now, somehow, the conversation had reached me. She didn't say it directly at first. She circled around it, talked about options, about what they had considered. Then finally, she said it. They needed my help. The words hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. I didn't respond immediately. Not to create drama, not to make a point. I just needed a moment. Everything slowed down. In that brief silence, a lot passed through my mind. The laughter, the shrug, the assumptions, all those moments where my efforts had been reduced to something amusing. And now suddenly, those same efforts mattered. Not in theory, in practice. I realized something important right then. They weren't calling because they believed in me. They were calling because they had no alternative. And that changed how I approached the moment. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear, clear about where I stood, clear about what this meant. I asked a few questions, simple ones, clarifying ones. She answered quickly, almost eagerly, as if afraid that if she hesitated, the opportunity would disappear. When she finished explaining, there was another pause. This one longer. She waited. So did I. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't the one trying to fill the silence. The roles had shifted, and she could feel it. She asked, carefully, if she thought I could help, not if I would, if I could. That distinction mattered. I told her I needed time to think. Her response was immediate. Of course, no pressure. We can wait. After the call ended, I sat still for a moment, not replaying the past, not planning revenge, just acknowledging reality. The moment had arrived, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, exactly the way I always knew it would. I didn't make a decision right away. I didn't rush to respond, and I didn't enjoy the pause. I simply let it exist. That silence felt different from the ones before. Earlier, silence had been protective, a boundary. Now it was evaluative. I replayed the call in my head. Not the words, the tone, the uncertainty, the careful phrasing. For the first time, they weren't assuming anything about me. They were waiting. That was new. I thought about everything that had happened before. The laughter, the dismissal, the way my effort had been reduced to something insignificant. Not with cruelty, with confidence. And confidence can be harder to forgive because it doesn't think it's wrong. I asked myself what I wanted out of this, not what would feel satisfying, not what would prove a point. What would leave me at peace afterward? Helping wasn't the problem. I had never been unwilling to help. The problem was returning to a place where my value depended on explanation. I knew I couldn't do that again. So I started thinking in terms of limits. What I was willing to do, what I wasn't. What conditions mattered, what expectations needed to change. That clarity didn't come all at once. It came gradually, piece by piece. I realized something else, too. They hadn't called because they suddenly respected me. They called because the situation demanded competence. And competence doesn't care who laughed before. That gave me leverage. Not power over them, control over myself. I spent the rest of the day as usual. Worked, cooked, went for a walk. I didn't sit around waiting for another message. If anything, that routine grounded me. It reminded me that my life didn't revolve around their approval anymore. Later that evening, a message came in. Not urgent, not dramatic, just a simple check-in, asking if I had thought about it. I read it once, then put my phone down. I wasn't avoiding the answer. I was making sure it came from the right place. When I finally replied, I kept it brief. I said I could help, but not immediately and not without a conversation. There was no pushback, no defensiveness, just acceptance. That alone told me how much had changed. We set a time to talk, a proper conversation, not rushed, not emotional. When the call ended, I felt something unexpected. Not relief, balance. For the first time, I wasn't stepping into a family dynamic already defined by their assumptions. I was entering as myself, quiet, prepared, clear. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be laughed at again. Not because I demanded respect, but because I had learned when silence should end and when it should stay. And this time, I was choosing my words carefully. The conversation happened the next day, right on time. No delays, no excuses. That alone was unusual. I could tell they were taking it seriously. When the call started, the tone was different. No jokes, no casual remarks, just focus. My sister spoke first. She explained the situation again, more clearly this time, more carefully. She asked if I had questions. I did. Not many, but important ones. I asked about expectations, about deadlines, about what would happen if things didn't go as planned. She answered honestly. There was no exaggeration, no confidence she didn't actually feel. When she finished, my parents joined the call. That hadn't been mentioned before. It didn't surprise me. They were quiet at first, listening. That was new too. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was softer. She said they appreciated that I was willing to talk, not help, talk. That distinction mattered. I responded calmly. I said I could help, but only under certain conditions. Not demands, conditions. I explained them clearly. No interruptions, no raised voices. I spoke slowly. I said what I was willing to do and what I wasn't. I said what support I needed and what assumptions had to stop. I didn't mention the past. I didn't bring up the laughter. I didn't need to. The silence on the other end said enough. They listened. Really listened. No one rushed to respond. No one tried to negotiate. They asked a few clarifying questions, practical ones, respectful ones, and then they agreed. Not enthusiastically, not with excitement, but with understanding. That was more valuable. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment, not replaying it, not analyzing every word, just noticing how I felt. There was no rush of satisfaction, no sense of victory, just steadiness. Something had shifted, not dramatically, but fundamentally. For the first time, I wasn't being tolerated, I was being trusted. And that trust hadn't come from persuasion, it had come from preparation. Over the next few days, things moved quickly. Information was shared, plans were adjusted. I did what I said I would do, no more, no less. I kept communication clear, professional. Boundaries stayed in place. No one tested them. They didn't need to. The dynamic had changed. I noticed it in small ways. How they spoke to me, how they waited before responding, how they asked instead of assuming. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, but it was real. And I understood something then. Silence hadn't just protected me, it had trained them. It had taught them how to approach me differently. Not through force, not through confrontation, through absence. By stepping back, I had given them space to realize what they were missing. And now that they saw it, they were careful. Because once respect arrives quietly, it tends to stay. As the days went on, I paid close attention to how I felt. Not just to what was happening, but to what wasn't happening anymore. There were no jokes, no casual remarks meant to minimize my role, no side comments. Everything stayed direct. clear, and calm. That calm was unfamiliar. In the past, family situations always carried tension, a need to explain, a need to justify. Now, there was none of that. I realized something important. The respect I was experiencing didn't come from my help. It came from my boundaries. Because this time, I wasn't stepping in emotionally. I wasn't trying to fix relationships. I was simply doing what I said I would do. Nothing more, nothing less. That consistency changed everything. At one point, my sister said something quietly, almost to herself. I didn't realize you had thought this through so carefully. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't dismissal either. I didn't respond right away. I let the moment pass. Not to be cold, but because I didn't need to fill the space. I had learned that silence, when used intentionally, doesn't weaken a conversation, it anchors it. My parents started checking in differently, not to monitor, but to understand. They asked how things were progressing, if timelines still made sense. They waited for my answer. They didn't interrupt. That alone felt significant. I noticed how my posture changed around them. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't rehearsing explanations in my head. I was present. And that presence came from certainty. Certainty that I wouldn't be talked over. Certainty that my words carried weight. At one point, I caught myself thinking about the version of me from months ago, standing there, smiling politely, being laughed at. That version of me had felt small, not because I lacked ability, but because I was asking for recognition from people who hadn't learned how to give it. I wasn't angry at them anymore. I understood something I hadn't before. People don't always disrespect you because they look down on you. Sometimes they disrespect you because you keep showing up without insisting on being treated differently. That realization stayed with me. As the situation moved closer to resolution, there was less tension in the air. Not because everything was easy, but because expectations were clear. No guessing, no emotional bargaining, just action. I kept my distance emotionally, not out of bitterness, out of self-respect. And in doing that, I noticed how differently they approached me. Carefully, thoughtfully, almost cautiously, as if they knew this version of me would not return to the old role. The role where I explained myself, the role where I accepted laughter as harmless. That role was gone. Not announced, not discussed, just gone. And no one tried to bring it back, because silence, once it changes a dynamic, doesn't need reinforcement. It just exists, and everyone adjusts around it. The situation eventually reached its turning point, not with drama, not with raised voices, with quiet resolution. What needed to be done was done. Decisions were finalized, loose ends were tied up. I followed through on everything I had agreed to. No shortcuts, no overpromising. And when it was over, there was a noticeable pause, the kind that follows something significant. No one rushed to speak, no one celebrated. We all just acknowledged silently that the outcome had changed things. My parents thanked me, simply, without embellishment. It wasn't emotional. It didn't need to be. My sister said something that surprised me. She said she hadn't expected me to handle things the way I did, so calmly, so decisively. I asked her what she had expected. She hesitated, then admitted she thought I would either say no out of resentment or say yes and overextend myself. She hadn't considered that I would set limits, that I would remain steady. I nodded. That made sense. For a long time, they had known me as someone who either explained too much or stayed silent entirely. They hadn't known this version, the one that spoke when necessary and stopped when done. The The dynamic between us didn't snap back to something warm or close. It didn't suddenly become perfect, but it did become honest. They no longer assumed they knew what I was thinking. They asked. They waited. That alone was a significant shift. I noticed how differently I felt around them. Not tense, not guarded, just neutral. I didn't need to impress them anymore, and I didn't need to protect myself from them either. That balance was new. Later that evening, I was alone. I thought about the path that led here, the laughter, the months of silence, the slow, deliberate preparation, and I realized something important. If I had spoken up back then, if I had argued or defended myself, none of this would have happened this way. They would have dismissed it. They would have laughed harder. The silence had given them space to underestimate me, and that underestimation had become my advantage. Not because I planned it, but because I didn't fight it. I allowed them to be wrong for as long as they needed. And when reality finally caught up, there was no argument to win, just facts to accept. That realization settled in quietly, without triumph, without bitterness, just understanding. I hadn't changed who I was to earn their respect. I had simply stopped trying to earn it at all. And in doing that, I had created the conditions for it to arrive naturally. After everything settled, life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were no emotional reunions, no dramatic apologies, and I was okay with that. What mattered wasn't what was said afterward. It was what didn't happen anymore. No laughter, no dismissive smiles, no assumptions spoken out loud. They treated me differently now. Not cautiously, not awkwardly, respectfully. And that respect wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It showed up in small ways. They listened when I spoke, they didn't interrupt, they didn't rush to correct me. They asked questions and waited for the answers. I noticed it most in moments that used to feel uncomfortable. Family gatherings, casual conversations. I no longer felt the need to prepare myself. I didn't rehearse explanations in my head. I didn't brace for jokes. I simply showed up, and that was enough. At one point, my sister made a comment that would have once turned into a joke. She stopped herself halfway, looked at me, and changed her tone. That small pause said more than any apology could. It told me she understood. Not fully, not emotionally, but practically. She knew the old dynamic no longer applied, and she respected that. My parents adjusted too. They didn't suddenly become different people, but they became more careful with their words, more aware. They no longer assumed that silence meant weakness. They had seen what silence could hold, and they didn't underestimate it again. As for me, I felt lighter, not because I had proven anything, but because I hadn't needed to. That urge to explain myself had disappeared. I no longer felt responsible for managing how others perceived me. I had learned something important. People don't always need to be convinced. Sometimes they need time. Time to underestimate you, time to ignore you, time to believe their own assumptions. And if you're patient enough, time will correct them for you. Silence isn't about disappearing, it's about choosing when to be heard. And in my case, waiting changed everything. Not because I planned a payoff, not because I wanted revenge, but because I let reality speak when words no longer could. And when it did, it spoke clearly, without laughter, without doubt, just truth. And that was enough.